Hi everyone, and welcome to the 10th lesson in our And in Spectacles GCSE revision series. If you haven't seen any of the videos that I've done so far on this, what we're doing is going through all of the characters, the themes, the context, and model answers to make sure you have everything you need before you sit this exam. And if you're in year 11, you are going to be sitting this exam very, very soon. So in the previous 9 weeks, we've gone through Mr. Burling, Eric, Eva, the inspector, Gerald, Mrs. Burling, Sheila. We've also gone through class division and some model answers. Today, we're going to be tackling capitalism versus socialism, which is one of the other major themes in the play. If you haven't seen any of those previous videos, I highly recommend you watch them because every single one of them has loads of quotes, model paragraphs that you need for all of these different characters and themes. And you can literally use some of this to help yourself ready for the exam. So capitalism versus socialism. I actually used this exact same picture for class divide, so I feel like I've cheated, but I couldn't find a good picture of capitalism versus socialism, and I don't have time, unfortunately. I'm a full-time teacher to create my own graphics. So there you go. Capitalism, I guess, sitting at the top, socialism sitting at the bottom. Anyway, we got some quotes to go through on capitalism versus socialism together, and then we'll do a model paragraph as we normally do. So a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. And so this is Mr. Burling. There's these uses of dashes as well to show that he's like saying this spontaneously and very passionately. This is the mindset of a capitalist, or the mindset of some capitalists, not all, to look after himself and his own. So Priestley was a socialist, obviously. Priestley wants to make capitalism look as bad as possible. So he's trying to make it seem that capitalists only care about themselves and money and their families and no one else. That's not obviously strictly true. There are lots of businesses that care deeply about their customers and care about social impact and the environment and all that good stuff. But back then in 1912, this would have been much more the stereotypical capitalist. So one of the ways capitalism is presented as very greedy, self-serving, quite toxic, really, because it doesn't care about anyone other than the person making the money. And Mr. Burling obviously fits that description pretty well in the play. There's a stage direction, the sharp ring of the doorbell. This is when Mr. Burling is talking about capitalism. And then the inspector rings the doorbell and it's a sharp ring that cuts through Mr. Burling's talk. I think that this is very deliberate. It's meant to be that J.B. Priestley is saying that socialism cuts through capitalism if you think it through. That's his opinion on socialism. And so this is a symbol of that socialism cutting through capitalism. You'd think everybody has to look after everybody else, Mr. Burling. So again, we have this depiction of capitalism as very greedy and self-serving. And this line, as the reader or as an audience, we would feel that Mr. Burling is incredibly selfish, right? The fact that he's like stroppy about the idea he might have to look after anyone but himself, you know? So again, it puts this idea that this very vivid idea that socialism is all caring for everyone and capitalism is not caring for anyone. And so Mr. Burling, again, is what we call a caricature of that. Mr. Burling is a caricature of capitalism. If Mr. Burling comes up, or if the theme of capitalism versus socialism comes up, I want you to remember that and put that phrase in. Mr. Burling is a caricature of capitalism. Lower costs and higher prices. So another thing that Priestley talks about in terms of socialism through this play is this idea that capitalism is built in a way that will always disadvantage the worker. Now, again, that's not strictly true, but from Priestley's socialist perspective and from Priestley's perspective of trying to make socialism look as good as possible, capitalism look as bad as possible, this is a really great way of showing that, right? So this juxtaposition, the idea that Mr. Burling wants to pay his workers like Eva Smith as little as possible because that's his costs. He wants to give them as little money as possible, as little stuff as possible, but highest prices possible. So he wants to charge as much as he can for the products he's putting out. And that really is very greedy and selfish, right? Because That's not the way that the world should work, obviously, because you want to pay your workers fairly to make sure they have enough money and they're comfortable. They're not just your slaves, they're meant to be human beings that actually thrive from working in your factory or your business or whatever, right? And highest prices as well. You don't, in the world of today, for sure, you don't want to piss your customers off by charging more than the product is worth, right? And I will just say that this isn't really how capitalism works, obviously, because we live in capitalist societies in the West. If a company were to not pay its workers properly now, then obviously those workers would move to another factory or another place where they were paid better. And if a product is overpriced, let's say, I don't know, let's just say that this is stupid, you wouldn't charge for a glass of water, but let's say this glass of water is 50 pence in one shop and 5 quid in another, then obviously everyone's going to give their business to the shop that's 50 pence. And the shop that charges $5 or £5 or whatever wouldn't be able to stay in business because no one would buy the product. But what Priestley is getting at through the marriage of Sheila and Gerald is this idea that the upper class have like a stranglehold on society in 1912, that there aren't any other options. And so when you think of it in that sense, then Priestley absolutely does have a point, which is if you live in Edwardian England, where there weren't unlimited factories, there weren't unlimited products like there are today, then capitalism can have some real problems if you don't have good workers' rights, which clearly they don't have workers' rights at this time. So what I'm talking about here is obviously context and what you would talk about in terms of context of capitalism versus socialism. We then have the Titanic mentioned. The Titanic is arguably a great symbol of what capitalism can do. It's this enormous ship that was not meant to be sinkable, and obviously it did sink. So it's this idea that Titanic is meant to symbolize capitalism and give this sense that capitalism will sink and fail. That's what J.B. Priestley believed. We're over 100 years past 1912 now, 110 years nearly, and capitalism still hasn't sunk, thank God. But that is his argument, is that capitalism will sink. And in some sense, he had a point for sure, though, because capitalism changed, right? We went from a time where there were no workers' rights, no unionization, nothing really for the worker, to now a time where workers do have good rights, health and safety, benefits. There are unions to make sure that workers aren't being exploited, etc., etc. Yeah. So capitalism did change from the 1912 version that Priestley is talking about. Mr. Burling says, probably a socialist or some sort of crank. So this is how capitalism views socialism. It's this idea that people like Priestley, who are socialists in early 1900s, would have been dismissed and called cranks or idiots or maniacs or crazies, right? And what Priestley's trying to say in this play is actually socialism does have some good points. And that's true. Socialism does have some good points. You can link that to the 1948 NHS being founded in England. That's a really good context to add in. So obviously, NHS is a very good idea. It helps the poor, if they don't have money to pay for medicine and treatment, to have medicine and treatment. Whereas back in 1912, before this, if you were sick and you didn't have money, then you wouldn't really have had access to doctors or medicine or treatment, which is a big problem. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. So this is a triad. We don't live alone. We're members of one body. We're responsible for each other. So that emphasizes this socialist message of actually, we live together. We belong to a community. We should look after each other. It's a very strong, compelling message. And I think that is absolutely true, right? Socialism is wrong in many ways, but it has some things right, which is that social responsibility, looking after one another, is a good thing. And capitalism sometimes doesn't allow us to look after one another properly. And that is a problem that we have to address. So this again shows socialism in a very emphasized light, very positive light. They will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. This is a tricolon. So the tricolon here helps to emphasize this idea that capitalism will never work in Priestley's opinion, and it will only ever lead to war. And Priestley even goes as far as to sort of suggest that the war, World War I and World War II, was caused by capitalism. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not a historian, I'm not a World War I or World War II expert by any means, but I do think most historians would disagree with that analysis. I think most historians would agree more likely that, particularly World War II, one of the major reasons we had to go to war was obviously human rights issues. You can't have some crazy person like Adolf Hitler genociding people, right? Throwing all the Jews into concentration camps. You just can't have it. You have to fight for the rights of those human beings. But anyway, this tricolon is Priestley trying to suggest that capitalism is one of the major causes of war, and socialism would stop that war happening. Okay, we've got 4 more quotes, then we'll do our model answer. So the inspector, when talking about Eva, said she turned to a different kind of life. This is a euphemism for the fact that Eva Smith starts to prostitute herself. She becomes a prostitute, selling her body for money, because once she'd worked at the factory and been fired, and then worked at Millward's, the clothing shop, and been fired, she didn't have many other options. So that also presents the capitalist world of 1912 as very harsh. The idea that a young woman full of intelligence and strength and promise can't find any work, legitimate work, other than selling her body for sex is terrible. It's an absolutely terrible thing. And the idea that that presents capitalism as very evil is clear. She knew it couldn't last. The inspector also says this when interrogating Gerald. So this is talking about how Eva or Daisy knew that she wouldn't be able to marry or stay with Gerald, even though she loved him. So again, that shows capitalism in a very bad light. It suggests that because of the class division of 1912, because Gerald was upper class and she was working class, they couldn't fall in love, they couldn't be together, and she knew that from the very beginning. There's also an irony to capitalism in the play. So Eric and Gerald at different times give Eva Smith money. One of the simple quotes is Eric says, "I gave her some money." I think Gerald says almost exactly the same thing. So there's this irony to that, because the capitalists are the ones that don't want any unionization of workers, any benefits for workers, any like unemployment, sort of safety, social security, any of that stuff. And yet when Eric and Gerald are faced with a starving woman in front of them, their instinct is to look after her. They, you know, possibly for their own gain as well, sadly. Like obviously Gerald was very attracted to Daisy, and so was Eric. Attracted to Eva, same woman obviously, but at the same time they still give social security to Eva, right? Gerald gives her a house to live in, temporary housing. He gives her money, and Eric gives her money to support her. So all of this is an idea of socialism and social security. If you don't have money to look after yourself, then the government or government programs will give you money to help you. Final quote, Mr. Burling says, "I'd give thousands." So this is near when the inspector leaves. And Mr. Burling says this to cover his own arse, basically. He says this because he is worried about the public scandal, the fact that he had Eva Smith fired and all that stuff. And there's just this, again, irony to the fact that Mr. Burling wasn't willing to give Eva Smith a tiny little pay rise, like 30 pence or something, pay rise. He wasn't willing to give her that, but he was willing to pay the inspector thousands of dollars in what seems to be like a bribe to cover up the fact that he didn't pay her 30 pence extra an hour and got her fired, and now she's died and stuff. So you just get this sense of the capitalism being a bit inconsistent from that. Again, I don't think that that is completely fair or true of capitalism, but in this play, in this caricature of capitalism, definitely that's the case. Okay, so we're going to do a paragraph on how is capitalism versus socialism presented, and we're going to do a paragraph on how capitalism is presented as a caricature and very negative. So one of the ways that capitalism is presented in the play is as a very negative caricature, particularly through the character Mr. Berling. So we start with a nice model paragraph. We can see this in the quote, lower costs and higher prices, since the juxtaposition here shows Mr. Berling and therefore capitalism's ultimate goal. Lower costs has connotations of mistreatment of workers, since paying them is the central cost to a business, and the desire to pay them less would have been very upsetting for the audience, knowing that the working class would struggle to make ends meet as it was. Furthermore, higher prices suggests the greed of capitalism through the idea of charging as much money for a product as you can get away with. Later, let's see what else we want to do. Here we go. Actually, let's just say additionally, the concept Mr. Berling lives by of a man has to mind his own business and look after himself is incredibly greedy and suggests that capitalism creates a world of people who refuse to look after each other. As an audience of post-war England of 1945, these attitudes were looked down upon, and this is particularly shown through the victory of Clement Attlee and his Labour Party in 1945, and the formation of a fairly socialist idea, the National Health Service, in 1948. Okay, so we've started with a point of how capitalism is a negative caricature. We've gone through a quote here and explained how it shows that negativity of capitalism. And then we've gone into a second quote and explained how that second quote also shows the greed and negative view of capitalism at the time. And then we finished off with a little bit of audience or reader response. I say audience because it's a play, so it would have mostly been watched in theatres. And then we've done some context. Clement Attlee was Prime Minister in 1945, won in a landslide victory with the Labour Party, which was a more socialist and party overall, and the National Health Service, which is a fairly socialist concept, was also formed in 1948. So there you go, there's a model paragraph. I hope that was helpful. If you like the video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Good luck with your exams, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.